Could you tell us about the history of predictive processing before the free energy principle?
I could. It would take a long time, in the sense that the notion of predictive processing, which I tend to regard as something called active inference, I think was probably born in the days of Plato, was articulated in philosophy by people like Kant, and then taken up in a much more by physical sense by Helmholtz in the 19th century, and then has a sort of fluctuating history throughout the 20th century, suppressed to a certain extent by behaviorism, and sort of a focus on the overt behavioral systems, things like reinforcement learning. But underneath that, there were notions of things like analysis by synthesis, perception as hypothesis testing, perceptual control theory, the cybernetics movement, things like the good regulator theorem. All of these are probably quite obscure notions nowadays, but they do speak to a very rich and enduring legacy of this style of thinking. And this style of thinking is quite simply the sentient artifacts, sentient creatures, brains, you and me, are in the game of predicting what would happen if I did that, or what would happen if I was right about the state of the world that's generating my sensations. So it's a construction or a view of sentient behavior which puts the brain very much in an active and constructive mode, that it's generating hypotheses, explanations that are a best fit to the sensory evidence supplied by the outside world. So that's the emphasis on predictive, the processing, information processing. I would read that as inference or learning, depending upon the time scale. So you put the two together, you get predictive processing, which is now the term is interesting. I think was probably due to Andy Clark, who's one of the world's most famous philosophers and certainly neurophilosophers, and I think he brought it to the table to provide a label for a more generic way of understanding sense making in the service of inaction in a situated context, in an inactive context. In a way that distinguished it from very particular instances of implementation, such as predictive coding. So predictive coding was something that had been around for compressing sound files since the 1950s, but suddenly was a focus of attention in the neurosciences as a plausible way of compressing data via prediction in a really efficient way, in the spirit of sense making and perception. So what Andy wanted to do, I think, was say, well, yes, that's fine, but predictive coding in and of itself doesn't have this inactive, situated, embedded aspect to it. So let's think about the sort of how you'd make predictive coding work in an artifact that actually had to go and gather its own data and exchange and act upon the world. So that's my view of predictive processing, and the reason for the active inference is it emphasizes the active part, but under the hood, all of these processes, all of these ways of framing sense making can be expressed as the process of inference and or learning at a longer time scale.
So, is the addition that you're making going from just looking at it as a sensation information loop to adding active inference to it, so adding actual movement to it?
That's absolutely right. Yeah, I mean something obviously which people have been acutely aware of. You have the 4 E's movement, extended, embedded, and so on. You have notions of the action perception cycle. So in both of these sort of one could almost say paradigm shifts at the beginning of this century, there's this realization that closing the circle between, as you put it, the sort of the information, the sense making, the feed, the coupling from the environment into the sense-making organ or the brain, closing the circle, literally a perception action circle, by now saying, well, now the brain is in charge of setting the set points for its actuators, its reflexes, so that it can act upon the world that then generates more data. So you're closing the loop. So you've got sort of a bi-directional, a circular causality in play, which makes things much, much more interesting. So, sometimes I like to think of this in terms of, pre-active inference and predictive processing formulations of sentient behavior, certainly in the cognitive sciences and possibly even in machine learning, that you were thinking about pure sense making and how that could be articulated in terms of inference, very much along the lines of how a statistician would make sense of data, how a machine learning person would do some classification, would recognize things. But then you put on top of that, okay, what are you going to do about that? And of course, as soon as you put that into the game, then you have to address the rather vexed and intriguing question, okay, I've got these data and I've made sense of them, but now I'm in charge of gathering the data that I'm making sense of. And now you have a model which is much more apt for describing things like you and me, and indeed scientists. What do? They spend half their time performing experiments. They're acting on the world to generate some data. Then they try and make sense of it. They test the hypotheses. So it's that sort of circular causality, that action perception cycle, I think, is quite fundamental to this account of self-organization.
Right. It's a tricky history because, I mean, at some point we had to break away from behaviorism and looking at the brain as input output to seeing the deep nuances and complexities of the action perception cycle. But it's never clear where that break happened. If it was a one pointer or how it developed. It seems like a long story to get to it.
Yeah, yes, and you're probably in a better position to to summarize that narrative. From my perspective, it really has been almost a yin yang from what I know of the history. And of course, we were both too young to really know what actually was going on. But certainly, the rise of behaviorism and then its demise, with a greater focus on inference and classification and hypothesis testing. And then perhaps nowadays, perhaps in this century, the two are seen to work hand in hand. Perhaps that dialectic is not quite so evident. But it would be fascinating to read a book about all the different waves of understanding different kinds of intelligence over the past 2 centuries now, I would imagine.
Right. Yeah, it's spread out through so many fields and disciplines and people that it's very tricky to sort it all out. Yeah. Okay. So moving on, the free energy principle. Do you mind just describing the free energy principle?
Right. Not at all. There are two ways of describing it. I can either describe it from the bottom up or from the top down. So, in a sense, I think we've already covered the basic tenets of the free energy principle from a sort of low road bottom up approach, understood or read through the eyes of people trying to understand their own behavior and the behavior of animals and other biological creatures, biotic self-organization. And that story is basically, what are the imperatives for good predictive processing? Well, it's quite simple. You just basically want to minimize your surprise. Well, what does that mean? Well, it basically means being able to predict reliably, veridically, the sensations that you're encountering, both in the moment and as a consequence of moving. But in the moment, this is a sort of the predictive coding perspective. In the moment, if I've got some sensations and I want an explanation that is most apt for describing those sensations, then I have to have a model that articulates and expresses my explanation of what generated those sensations. That's, in my world, called a generative model. In machine learning, it might be called a world model, an internal model. Irrespective of what you want to call it, it's basically a probabilistic specification of what I would see if this was the state of the world out there. And if I now want to minimize my surprise, that is exactly the same as saying I want to render my beliefs about what's going on out there such that these sensations, these data are the least surprising, technically have the highest marginal likelihood given my model of the world. So that quantity underwrites nearly all imperatives and objective functions in statistics and in machine learning and evolution. Wherever you look, this fundamental quantity, this sort of I've called it surprise. You could also call it the log marginal likelihood. You could also call it the logarithm of the model evidence, the evidence for a particular model of some data. If you're in theoretical biology and you're an evolutionary theorist, you might even call it adaptive fitness. It's just the likelihood of a particular phenotype being a good fit for, or being a good model of its eco niche or its environment. So wherever you look, this fundamental quantity appears to be optimized in the sense, and it will look as if you are basically just positioning yourself or sampling the world in order to minimize surprise. And when you take this notion into the inactive domain, clearly in choosing what to do next, you don't have the sensations that ensue before you've made the movement. So now you have to appeal to, well, what would I see if I did that? And then you choose what to do on the basis of minimizing the expected surprise, the surprise expected following that particular plan relative to another plan. Technically, that's called entropy or uncertainty. So all we're saying is that we act in a way to minimize the uncertainty about what the uncertainty about the causes of our sensations. So that link, I think, is also useful in our conversation, because it says you now have an opportunity to express this imperative in terms of information theory. So because this fundamental quantity, this model evidence, or this marginal likelihood or adaptive fitness can be written as self-information in information theory, which is another word, a technical description of surprisal or surprise, whereas the average of the self-information or surprisal is entropy. So it all fits together very beautifully and licenses now a description of this characterization of self-organizing systems in terms of information theory. And that's where the free energy principle gets into the game. And you may be asking, well, why free energy? And I can tell you, I'm not sure how much depth to go into, perhaps very briefly. It would be a simple and almost tautological problem if we just describe systems as minimizing their self-information or minimizing their surprisal or minimizing their surprise. However, that would entail the ability of any system to actually evaluate this marginal likelihood or this fundamental quality, this surprise. Mathematically, you can't do that. You can't physically realize this. So what you do, or what one does, is when you're faced with these impossible integration, inference, marginalization problems, is to create it into an optimization problem by inducing a quantity that you can measure, you can represent, you can compute, that is always a bound, in the sense it's always smaller than or bigger than the thing you want to maximize or minimize. So in machine learning, that bound is known as an evidence lower bound. So if you recall, surprisal is the negative surprisal is the logarithm of the evidence, the model evidence. So the evidence lower bound now becomes this variational free energy, which means that if you keep on pushing it up, you're guaranteed to actually maximize to within the bound approximation the thing that you want to maximize, or you think is maximized by sentient creatures, or things that exchange in a sort of Bayes optimal way. Take reading this in terms of inference. In physics, the signs change. So in physics, you want to minimize the free energy, so you have to multiply everything by -1. This is very confusing for everybody,
Right.
but it has to be
Right.
said. So what that means is that this bound approximation that was invented on most readings of the history by Richard Feynman when he was converting an impossible path integral, literally in the path integral formulation of quantum electrodynamics. That integration problem was insoluble. So he converted it into an optimization problem by equipping academia with this variational free energy bound using variational calculus. And in that world, you want to minimize the free energy. And this, in turn, is exactly what people like E.T. James were saying when they were talking about physics as measurement, physics as a process of inference. And of course, because free energy is equal to some expected energy minus the entropy, minimizing free energy now becomes a maximum entropy principle. So the maximum entropy principle just is the free energy principle, qualified by the fact that, of course, we're talking about a maximum entropy principle under constraints. Where did the constraints come from? Well, they come from that expected energy. What is that energy? It's just the expected surprise, or the surprisal. It's the accuracy, if you like, with which you can predict your current sensations given a particular hypothesis or measurement or inference about what generated those particular measurements. So I've just given you a bit of the top-down high road explanation for the free energy principle, but on the back of linking predictive processing to the physics of sentience via information theory. There is actually one more part of the story that really is the free energy principle, and that's the observation that any system that individuates itself from the rest of the universe, that is statistically separable in a certain sense from the rest of the universe, must have a dynamics that looks as if it's doing a gradient flow on this exactly the same quantity, a gradient flow on the physicist's free energy, or if you take out the bound, this is just on the surprisal, which means that now you can understand neuronal dynamics, the dynamics of message passing and belief propagation, as something that is necessarily part of the dynamics of any system that manages to maintain itself as individuated or separate from its embedding space or its environment or eco niche.
Right. So then can we use that as a benchmark as a criteria for life, that any system that resists entropy and uses that principle is a living system, and then we can find the line from where there's no life and then there's life. I know that's a very touchy subject, and probably generalizing far more than that's what's allowed. But
Oh yeah, I think it's a great subject and a great question. And it's something which is occupying many of my colleagues who are thinking about the applications of the free energy principle. I should just qualify this: the free energy principle in and of itself is not terribly useful. It's a little bit like Hamilton's principle of least action, or the theory of natural selection. Knowing it is very pleasing, and it's sort of conceptually nice and pretty and round, and it makes a lot of sense, but it doesn't actually do very much for you until you apply it. So you have to apply the free energy principle to something, and usually that something is a description of a self-organizing system with a particular generative model. So so I just make that point. But a lot of people are now thinking about, well, what kinds of systems and what kinds of generative models would license you to draw a bright line between systems that persist over time that are non-living versus biotic systems, and then within biotic systems, to what extent can they be thought of as agents and having a degree of autonomy, and then within those, to what extent can you ascribe them sentience, and then within those, to what extent can you ascribe them self-awareness and consciousness? And so there are, I think this is a really great question. In answer to your question, I would very simply say that systems that look as if they comply with the free energy principle, or actually by definition, to exist as a system means that you are separable from not system, and therefore you must comply with the free energy principle. But you can comply with it in different ways, and one key thing I think that does draw a bright line between living and non-living is the ability to move. It's really, really simple. Technically, in my world, that separation is mediated by something called a Markov blanket. So you've got this notion of carving up all the states of a universe into four parts. The first are the states that are internal to the system, say, for example, your neural activity and connectivity. And then the second part are the external states, everything in the outside world that might include your body if your internal states were your brain states. And then crucially, the thing that individuates or separates or distinguishes, that keeps apart statistically the inside from the outside, and that's the Markov blanket. And that can be carved into two. One mediates the influences of the inside on the of the outside on the inside, so one-way traffic. And then the other one is the states that mediate the influence of the inside on the outside. Again, it's one-way traffic to a certain extent, and it's that one-way traffic that preserves its distinction. So that construct then suggests that there's a very simple taxonomy of things that, first of all, do and do not possess active states. So what does that mean? Well, it just means that they can't act upon their world. So a stone doesn't, if you looked at a stone and you looked at a tortoise, forget about everything else. The reason you might think the tortoise was a living and the stone wasn't is simply because it moves. And that's just an expression of having active states to complete that sort of Markov blanket, or sometimes referred to as a particular partition. The reason for particular partition is that, as a physicist, you might regard the internal states and their blanket states as a particle in a universe. So that would be the first thing. So I'd say that living stuff are just things that endure over time in virtue of the fact that they are moving.
So is this why the low road and the high road distinction has been useful in applying the free energy principle? If you have a high road where you sort of just know what the directive is, what the objective function will look like, then it's easier for people doing that work because they just have that reference point rather than having the whole constructive history.
Yes. I'm going to read your question as saying, what's the utility of having something like a free energy principle? And if you meant it in that spirit, then absolutely, it just provides a relatively simple account of the way that things are and the way that things behave, or must behave if they exist. And then within that relatively straightforward bit of physics and differential equations and density dynamics, then you can see the kinds of behaviors that you are very much interested in if you were an economist, or you were in machine learning, or you were in cognitive neuroscience, and you can see how all your favorite schemes and ideas suddenly have to be right and have to be enacted, and also how they relate to each other, and all the special cases you get. And you've just identified a really special case, which is the non-living thing that exists and possibly is making lots of sense. It's still probably doing predictive coding. So just think about the stone. The internal states of the stone will equilibrate thermodynamically with the temperature of the surface, its Markov blanket. So it's still making sense and modeling its environment in the sense it's representing the temperature of its local external milieu. But of course, it's not moving. So, so you're stuck in the 20th century without worry. You're stuck in the days of predictive coding because you haven't thought about what, can the same imperatives of minimizing surprise or expected free energy in the physicist sense, can they also be applied to the way that we act? And of course, then you start to think about, well, what would that look like? Well, it would simply mean acting upon the external states in a way to minimize surprise. What would that be? It would be a thermostat. It would be a homeostat. It would just be the simplest description of the simplest kind of biological self-organization, namely the physiology of homeostasis, keeping things within bounds, minimizing surprises about excursions from equilibrium or set points that characterize the creature at hand. And expressing like that immediately takes you back to the 1940s and the inception of cybernetics. For example, Roche Ashby's homeostat, which is just about this, this kind of just simple imperative, just keeping things within bounds. And how do you sort of position yourself so that you can keep things in within bounds using this simple reflex-like sort of circular causality between perception and action of a very, very elemental sort. So, that's, to my mind, a nice illustration of how all these things suddenly fit together under relatively simple physics or mechanics afforded just by thinking about the fundaments of how, what a thing is and how it maintains its separation from the rest of the world just by keeping certain sensed states within bounds. And using that kind of language, you see immediately, well, this is exactly what people in biology were trying to articulate when they're talking about autopoiesis, self-assembly, self-creation, more like self-maintenance from my perspective, but you get the spirit. If you're a chemist, you're talking about self-assembly. And then you can start talking about, does this relate to Turing pattern formation, reaction diffusion systems? What are special about these kinds of things? And then you say, I see, they're just statements of steady state pattern formation far from equilibrium. So immediately you're now back to the physics, the information theoretic physics of non-equilibrium steady states, which is where we started with the free energy principle, trying to work out the dynamics of something that is an open exchange with its environment, with its heat bath, if you like, via this permeable Markov blanket. So it all starts to hang together. I should just mention other things which people get upset when we ignore, or when I ignore, things like perceptual control theory. So, the notion that all of our purposeful behavior is just in the service of keeping our sensations, our sensed world within viable bounds, and that's a sufficient explanation of any behavior. And they're absolutely right. It's just keeping that surprise down.